What's up, everybody? Welcome back for another week of complete nonsense, probable technical failures, and in amongst it, some F1 chat. This week, as you probably know by now, I have got something very special to give away. Many of you took part in this little giveaway that I teed up last week by sharing last week's video, having watched it. This microphone's really digging into me. I've been through all of those today, so thank you to everybody who took part in that. There were literally hundreds of you that did exactly that shared the video far and wide. Thank you for that, I appreciate it. And in response, your reward is that I have picked at random 2 people who kindly shared the video and said something nice about it as well. I've got those 2 names, which I will read out later on. So that's to look forward to. Of course, we're also going to talk about the French Grand Prix. I was very lucky today to be part of a select group of media to do a little session with the Aston Martin team, including Otmar Safnauer, also the CFO, plus one of their partners, IFS, who deals with software. The whole concept of this little meeting was around the cost cap. And so I thought we could talk about the cost cap. If you've got any questions about the cost cap over the course of the next hour, fire those in. I'll do my best. I definitely don't know all of it because it's still a hugely complicated set of regulations, that some of which they're still figuring out. But some interesting points. I asked a couple of questions to Otmar. I'll share those answers with you as well. So if you've got anything you want to talk about, fire it in now and we will go for it from there. Good evening to all of you. Thank you to everyone saying hello in the chat. I do appreciate it all the time. I always go back and read through all this, so even if I don't catch it all now, I do always go back and read through the comments. I try and respond to as many as I can. So we've got loads to talk about. Where shall we start? Well, Chris A. Let's start with Chris A. He's teed one up straight away that says, what would an F1 race team have to do if their expenses outweighed their budget in a race season with regards to introducing, for etc., new parts for future races? Would they have to cease factory operations? So good point. And that's also something they're figuring out. You may have seen over recent times, if you break the cost cap, if you're found guilty of breaking the cost cap, and that's a grey area in itself, how you're found guilty, what you're found guilty of, because of course, like anything, there are a number of exceptions. And what the guys were saying on the call today was they're looking in the same way the technical guys look at the technical regulations. They're of course looking for loopholes, but unlike the technical regulations, typically, because this is brand new and it's all for the good of the sport, almost all of the teams are joining together to try and close those loopholes now in this early phase of their introduction. So no one's really at this point, so they say, looking for an outright way to get around it, because in the first year there is some leeway in this whole thing anyway, and the whole point of doing this is to try and find ways to make the sport more fair, more close in terms of financial equality. So they're all working together to try and iron out the loophole. So in answer to your question, if the budget cap is broken, if the cost cap is broken, let's say they are found guilty, they're still currently deciding whether that will be a sporting penalty or something else, a financial penalty, which seems utterly ironic, doesn't it? If you spent too much money, you get hit with a fine. But there we go. They're still figuring all that out. In terms of what they would have to do if they were coming close to their budget and they were realising they wouldn't necessarily get to the end of the season, well, they have to figure out what they can hold back. It's not a case of ceasing factory operations, but it might be ceasing certain factory operations. For example, bringing further upgrades over the course of the season. It might get that tight. And there are so many things that factor into it. Crash damage, of course, impacts in your cost, in your budget. So if you've got a driver that keeps smashing the car up, you're able to bring less and less updates as the season rolls on. Your update budget, if you want, your development budget, gets hit with the more repair costs that your team is faced with over the course of a season. Engine failures, car failures, gearbox failures, all of these things come out of the budget. In fact, power units are separate from the budget cap, but they are part of your budget. When you buy an engine, you buy a set number of engines from a power unit manufacturer. If that engine breaks and it's the team's fault because it's been used incorrectly, they still have to pay out for an extra engine. So there's so many levels of complexity to it, but effectively the big decision for teams is balancing performance upgrades, and this is how it's going to go on as the budget shrinks and shrinks. The technical team and the financial team within a Formula One operation have got to work so much more closely to decide what they can afford to spend money on and how much benefit it's going to bring them. You might find that, you know, the advantages or the innovations that cost a lot of money that bring only a very small advantage, they get pushed to one side, because you need to spend your money on something that's going to give you the biggest possible return. And so that will be a whole new way of shaping how the development programs shape up over the next few years. Yeah, front wings, whoever says that, Josh Grenwald. Yeah, front wings are definitely going to be a big expense, certainly with certain teams who keep ploughing them into walls. Those Pirelli failures were quite expensive, says Rob Graham. So that's a good point. So things like an external supplier like Pirelli, who the teams pay some money to in exchange for a supply of tyres which are then supposed to do the job. And that's a big part of why this investigation is going on, and Pirelli are so quick to say, well, hang on, it's not necessarily just a tyre failure. It could be that the team were running them under pressure, or the team were running incorrect cambers, or they ran them for too long, or whatever they might say. It's not necessarily just a clear-cut, this is Pirelli's fault, or this is a driver's fault, or a team's fault. There will be some ambiguity about that, how that shapes up. If it's absolutely a tyre failure down to incompetence from Pirelli, you can very much expect Aston Martin and Red Bull to be going to Pirelli to say, well, hang on, we've got a contract with you where we pay this set amount of money, you provide us with tyres worthy of the job, and if they weren't up to the job, you've broken the contract. So those kind of things will start to get messy about who pays for what. Typically in the past, the teams just pay for all crash damage. It's never really been argued over, certainly in the most part. Occasionally some of the smaller teams have to get into that kind of argument, but that's going to become an even bigger feature as the next couple of years roll on. Are the adjustments to rear wing rules going to have a big effect on the Red Bull performance this weekend? Well, we will have to find out. It's definitely going to have an impact, and it's not just Red Bull. Red Bull are the most high profile of these because they are doing so well right now. But there are lots of teams. AlphaTauri, another really notable one that clearly has a flexi wing. I think Alfa Romeo, I'm sure we've seen it, but pretty much everybody has been designing to the current tests. If the tests now change, a lot of people will have to redesign those rear wings, even if they don't think they were doing it to gain an advantage. The test has now become stricter, and therefore your design parameters have to reflect that. So this is going to cost a lot of people a lot of money. And on that very subject, Carl S says, what about rule changes and the need to redesign parts like the rear wings this weekend? That's a good point, but it is coming out of the budget cap. The FIA would say, look, we've always had in the regulations that we are free to change the tests at any point, because the regulations are not really about the test. The regulations are about banning flexible bodywork, flexible wings. The tests were there in place that they deemed to be appropriate, but if they're no longer deemed appropriate to police the current regulations, the regs haven't changed, the tests are changing, and therefore the FIA will say, well, I'm sorry, there's nothing changed in the regulations, it's just the testing procedure. If you've been creating flexi wings, we think that goes against the spirit of the regulations, and our tests are now going to change to reflect that, therefore you need to make sure your parts are up to standard. So that cost will come out of the team's budget. Varun Sambi says Red Bull, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, Ferrari and Alpine all flexi. Yeah, and I'm sure others are, because as I've mentioned many times before, it's just how flexible are they? Everybody's wing flexes under the highest load conditions, it's just how much it's able to do that. So everybody's got to take a very close look at how that now works with these new tests. Do you think the new test will cause Red Bull to take a step back? So similar question. I mean, I don't know is the truth. They are definitely going to lose an advantage. I mean, it's very clear to see. The physics are obvious of what's happening with that Red Bull wing. As it rotates back, it dumps drag along the straights. The French Grand Prix is at a circuit that has some very long, very high speed straights, and therefore you'd say that that would have been an advantage. If they're now having to peg that back, some of that advantage at least will be lost. Having said that, they've still got a very quick, capable car, so how much of that is lost, we won't really know. And it's also not fair to just judge Red Bull's performance this weekend, particularly, let's say, in comparison to Mercedes, just based on the new rear wing tests. There is also a 20% leeway for I think 3 months as teams get to grips with the new designs of their rear wing. So it's not yet set in stone at the highest or the strictest level. But also this is a very different circuit to the two that we've just come from. So the performance difference between a Mercedes and a Red Bull are likely to be very different anyway, just because of the nature of the track. So don't jump to conclusions this weekend if suddenly Mercedes are quicker, for example, and say, well, it's all about that flexi wing, because that would be very, very unlikely. It's much more that Mercedes should be stronger this weekend than they have been over the last two anyway. Will the cost cap favour manufacturers as they could hive off departments as external sponsors, i.e. Mercedes performance engines become sponsors of a Mercedes team and supply for free? Well, this is obviously something, as they discussed today, they're all looking at very closely. There are a number of areas like that. These are the loopholes that I was talking about earlier. Now, when it comes to engines and power units, that falls outside of the cost cap anyway right now, so that's not necessarily an issue, but it could effectively happen in other departments, in theory. But of course, everyone's wise to that, and so they are trying to find ways to reword the regulations to close down those loopholes that teams, already might be thinking is possible. And bear in mind, it's only really at this stage the top 3 teams who have an issue with this. Everyone else is kind of building up towards the cost cap. The top 3 are having to peg back to fall in line with the cost cap. So only really the top 3 are the ones who are having to, will be looking for advantages in terms of keeping performance whilst saving money. The others, of course, they're going to be doing that over time, but at the moment, they're all gradually growing to a point where they might get close to that cost cap. So they're the ones who are really working hard with the FIA to try and close these loopholes down that they think could potentially give the bigger teams the advantages. Can the budget cap be risen higher? So here's a good question which was brought up today. The budget cap at the moment, sorry, this microphone's really annoying me. The budget cap as it's set for this season was set with the set prescribed number of races in hand, so 23 races. They have certain clauses in this contract, in these regulations, that if a race is cancelled, like what's happened, of course, this year for the pandemic, there's a certain time frame, whereas if that race is cancelled at what they deem to be short notice, and the ones that have been cancelled, that classes as short notice, the teams get to keep their budget allocation for that race. So they don't lose the Singapore Grand Prix budget allocation, for example. They get to keep that. So that's a little bonus for them. But bear in mind, some costs will have already been incurred for the Singapore Grand Prix. Maybe flights, hotels, other costs around logistics and things like that will have already been incurred. So that extra budget is there to help swallow up some of those losses that a cancellation will cost the teams. Conversely, if races are added, then more budget gets added to the pot, and there's a set amount per race as they go up. So if they were to increase the calendar right now at short notice, or even for next year by another couple of races up to the maximum of 25, the budget cost cap would reflect that. It would go up in increments for each additional race. So it can, in theory, go up or down based on the calendar as it changes. Why can't they ask Mercedes Formula E team and use their knowledge to build better battery tech and regen tech? Well, yeah, of course they can. And using knowledge is essentially free, isn't it? And that is one of the advantages that teams have. They can go and speak to people, particularly the bigger teams where they have other organisations like a Formula E team, for example, like the Mclaren Applied Technologies arm of their group, or the road car arm, for example. If they're working on certain things, of course they can go and speak to those people. What they can't do is have those people make components for them and not account for it in the team's accounts. So they would have to sell that technology. If, for example, McLaren was taking something from their road car business, well, let's say it was some kind of electrical box, whether it was a wiring harness or anything you like, they would have to sell that to the F1 team. And the accountants can go through those accounts and they would have to determine that that was being sold at a fair price, not something that was ridiculous, not a nominal fee of £1. They would have to make sure that was being done at a fair price and then recorded in the team's account. So these are all the kind of complexities that are really that are really being worked on right now. I don't know what's happened here, but this is causing a right pain in my neck. Is Mercedes imploding under pressure as the first time it's had serious competition? I really don't think so. I think it's way too early. It's come off the back of 2 racetracks which didn't suit their car. And I'm sure that when we get back to a more regular circuit, we'll see their more regular performance levels. What they have definitely got is competition, and that does change things because strategy for Mercedes in the past few years has been pretty free, in that their biggest challenge has been making sure they're fair to both of their own 2 drivers, given that they should have a big advantage over the whole rest of the field. Now they don't have that. Now they've got competition. Their strategy needs to take into consideration what Red Bull and maybe even others are doing at certain times, what they might be going to do. Have they got 2 cars in the fight, whereas maybe Mercedes at times have only had 1? They're definitely feeling the effects of that, but I definitely wouldn't go as far to say as they are imploding. Right, leave it out with the Bottas jokes. The FIA are going to need 1 million accountants. Well, they kind of are, and they kind of have. So they have employed one of the world's biggest accounting firms. I actually forget which one it is now, but it is one of the big 3 or big 4, whatever they are, to audit all of the Formula 1 teams. They did last year as a trial. So teams last year were volunteering their accounts in preparation to try and get this thing working. There were no penalties, there were no rules around it. It was just a trial run. This year they will be audited, and moving forward they'll be audited by this external firm. So they are going to be policed in the strictest possible fashion. They're taking it very, very seriously. That was the first thing. Another point that I brought up, and I asked Otmar Safnauer about this, was, and I've mentioned this to you because it's something I feel quite strongly about, is now that we're operating under a cost-capped environment, can we get rid of a lot of the technical restrictions that were put in place to save teams from escalating costs to a ridiculous level? So could we open up the tech rules and say, look, there you go, you design a car within some very broad regulations, spend whatever you want as long as it stays under this certain cap that we all agree on. So if you want to spend a lot of money on designing flexible rear wings or active suspension or DAS systems for your steering and front toe angles, if you deem that to be a worthy expense, go for it. Other teams might deem something else to be worthy of expenditure, and we might get some variation. Obviously, it will start to narrow down and people will converge on the same kind of tech over time, but for me, a lot of the technical restrictions, and they are so restrictive, the technical regs, it was all put there to save money. We no longer need to do that. So I asked that to Otmar, and he totally agreed. He says he feels very strongly about it as well, that he feels the same. The whole team, and in fact all of the teams, have that same kind of opinion, but the financial regulations are current, and the technical regulations are now set in stone because we've got this big change for 22. They are pretty much set in stone for the next few years. When we get to the next big reshuffle on technical regs, that's definitely something that everybody is well aware is likely to happen, and I think most people think should happen. If the cost cap regulations have got to a stable level where they're working well and everyone's figured out how best to operate under those, then the next step will be to free up the technical regs, which I think is a really exciting prospect in a couple of years. It may well be that that's 5 years down the line, but that's something for me that's big to look forward to. The rich teams will bend the financial rules or stretch the grey area. It won't work, I'm afraid. Oh, how negative, Bose Beaver. The general opinion today from those involved was that we are far from having this finalised. But what we have got is a really great starting point. Everyone tends to agree that the FIA have done a good job in putting a baseline set of regulations in, and that from there we can just keep building on it. We can keep getting bigger and bigger and better and improving them and tweaking them as we go through over time, as happens with everything. To get things perfectly right in the very first attempt was never going to happen, but everyone tends to agree they've got a good baseline and a good starting point to move forward from. So that has to be a positive, and that the teams are working together in the most part also is the most powerful resource to get this thing working as well as we can. Okay, shall we move it on from cost cap? Anyway, I just want to say a big thank you to Aston Martin for inviting me along today. It was really great. And their sponsor, IFS, because that was really nice of them. It's a really privilege to be part of this little group. Some really interesting chats, some really interesting information. It was a real nice insight. So maybe I'll drop some more of that as we go through later weeks when further questions start to arise. But really interesting to see that starting to unfold from a team's perspective. Let's move it on, because this one here says, would there be more overtaking in F1 if the cars were narrower? My guess is yes, definitely, says Chris A. And Maria Holland, yours has just flown off the top of the screen. Maria Holland says, make the cars smaller like they used to be. That would make for better racing. They're too heavy and too long. Well, that's exactly what Lewis Hamilton said, wasn't it, the other week? And of course he's right. Of course he's right. We go to a track like Monaco where it's the perfect example of it. The track was built many, many, many years ago when the cars were half the size, half the weight nearly, and of course the racing was better. Now, it's not all about that. The aerodynamic problems that we know we have today are a huge impact. There is a much more convergence in terms of technology and performance today than there was back then. We also had much faster cars further back down the grid finding their way through, cars that were faster at different times in the race due to things like refueling, and there were so many other variables. It was a completely different sport back then. However, as those two guys have rightly said, one of the big problems, particularly at somewhere like Monaco and the narrow parts of Baku, for example, the streets are so narrow that, I mean, you physically can't fit more than two cars side by side on a racetrack, let alone trying to wind their way around the streets. If you saw my video on Instagram of me at Baku pacing out that bit between the castle walls, it was 5 paces from one side of the track to the other. I mean, all right, that's an extreme example, but if we want cars to be racing each other all the way around a lap, wheel to wheel, or at least have that opportunity, of course we need either bigger racetracks or smaller cars. And the cars are so heavy and so big now compared to what they used to, then absolutely, I 100% agree with Lewis and with both of you two guys who just mentioned that. It seems like a no-brainer. We've gradually grown and grown and grown. It's not been some big decision that suddenly says, right, we need to have enormous cars. It's incremental gains each year that's gradually crept up on us. And now we've reached this point where everyone's going, wow, I mean, have you seen how big these cars have got? And it's happened over many years. And I do think that it's something we could start to look at bringing back over time. But that is going to mean some compromises in other areas, as we know. Thoughts on reducing wind tunnel use for teams? I'm amazed that teams still use wind tunnels. Genuinely, I'm amazed. I definitely, obviously I understand why they do it, but CFD now, computational fluid dynamics, is so advanced that actually we could have ditched wind tunnels a few years ago and still been, I reckon, as productive, if not more productive, in terms of aerodynamic development just using CFD. It would be a huge cost saving. It would be a much more efficient way of going about racing, and it's developing some very advanced technological tools in terms of CFD that the wider world can benefit. Wind tunnels are expensive, they're inefficient, they're old school, they're enormous, they take up a lot of real estate, they're expensive to build and to run. And, I've got friends in the Red Bull aero department who I think 3 or 4 years ago were saying to me, I think this could be the last year that we actually operate with a wind tunnel because our CFD is advanced enough to be able to make the switch over. Of course, when the regulations say you can have a certain amount of wind tunnel and a certain amount of CFD, you're not going to pass it up. You're not going to let go of it voluntarily because it's additional development time. But if the FIA stepped in or Formula One stepped in and said, right, we want to ban wind tunnels from a set period, I don't think anybody is going to suffer from that because the technology, the alternative technology, is so advanced. What has the second place finish done by Vettel? What is it done for Aston Martin by Vettel finishing second, says Sandy Barnes? Well, it's given them a huge boost. I mean, we talked about that on the call today as well. They expected better things this year. They firmly blame their lack of performance in the early part of this season on the regulation changes at the rear of the car, the aero reg changes, combined with the pandemic restrictions in terms of not being able to develop your car. So having to use last year's car this year because of the pandemic has locked in their their low rake concept car that they plumped for last year when it worked really well. This year, they say that given what they now know, they would 100% be switching and developing their car to a high rate concept car, because that's where they know the performance is to be gained, and yet they can't do it. And that's very firmly where they place a big portion of the blame for their lack of performance. So they expected greater things, or they hoped for greater things this year. They've had a very difficult first few races, but the last two races, for Sebastian particularly, have been really strong. And actually for Lance, up until his accident, was also looking quite strong. Otmar suggested today they think that if Stroll had been allowed to continue, hadn't had the tyre failure, they would have had a second place with Sebastian and a fifth place potentially with Stroll as well, which would have been a really strong team result. So it's given them a boost, given everyone a boost, but they are very much keeping their feet on the ground, aware that they may well be circuit-specific improvements to that car at the moment. CFD is also used in architecture as fire simulation in buildings. Yeah, it's used everywhere. That's my point. It's such a widely used technology that if F1 can be pushing the boundaries of that and developing it faster than any other industry, then F1 has some product that then has value in the wider world, something we can sell on or shout about as being something that's come from F1. We don't have very many of those things anymore where we can say this came out of F1 and now everyone's using it in their road cars. Of course they happen, and they've happened a lot more in the old days, but it's few and far between now. So if we can shout about a technology like that, or whether it's sustainable fuels that are coming on the horizon with the next set of power units, those are the things that have the biggest value to F1, because we can develop it way quicker than most other people can, and then we can put it out into the wider world. Can teams use a 3-cylinder turbo instead of a V6? No, they can't. They can't, because the rules, right now very clearly specify that the engine has to be a V6. So everything's very tightly restricted. But as I was saying earlier, given that we have a cost cap, if we fine-tune that cost cap, maybe we could open up those technical regs to allow some variation in various teams' technologies. COVID has caught half the teams out. The cost cap came in earlier than the teams thought it would. Well, it hasn't necessarily caught them out, because the cost cap came in with the full agreement of everybody involved. So it's not like it's caught them out. They all agreed to bring it in earlier because it was the right thing to do. It was actually beneficial to all of them as well in saving, in saving money. The smaller teams want the cost cap because it pegs back the bigger teams. The bigger teams don't necessarily want it because they're having to find ways to shed budget. But pretty much everyone else, 3/4 of the grid, are loving the fact that the cost cap has come in. Is there any talk of using synthetic fuels in the future, says Alan Wild? Absolutely. I mean, that is exactly what the next set of power unit regulations are being centred around. Eco-fuels, sustainable fuels, in whatever form that is. Hasn't been specified in any way yet in what form it will take, but that's absolutely what we've got. You've already had an increase this year in the percentage of eco-fuel in the current fuel for the F1 cars. That goes up again next year. I forget the actual percentages. I think it goes to 10% next year. But in 2025, when the next set of power unit comes in, that's the plan is that the engine will all be centered around eco-fuel, so that we can get to a point where we're using 100% sustainable ecological fuel, and that's again something that Formula One can then shout about. Bradley Austin says, how was the rallying? The rallying was awesome. You'll see that on Wheeler Dealers later this year. That was a filming for Wheeler Dealers that we did. If you saw it on my Instagram, I had a day of rallying last week. Also, just randomly off topic, I've also had a weekend this weekend away surfing. Again, check my Instagram. I went to the most amazing man-made surfing lake down in Bristol, and we had family surf lessons. It was epic. It was lovely. It was wicked. And I did manage to get up on the board. Not very often, but I did, and it's enough to give me the bug, and I want to go back. But that's another story altogether. Right, how are teams like Ferrari and Mclaren competing for pole on Saturdays whilst being significantly behind on race pace? Well, that's a good question. So, and it's also similar to the way that you know, if you look at the Lewis Hamilton of last weekend and Max Verstappen, for example, these teams, you know, it's a very different car. If you could have two cars, you'd have a completely different car for Saturday to the one you'd have for Sunday. Because Saturday, you don't care about tyre management. You don't care about longevity, about how long your stint's going to be, about looking after your tyres. You care about one lap, getting the most out of your car and your package for that one lap. So the cars would be totally different if you could do that. You can't do that because as soon as you leave the garage for qualifying on Saturday, you're in Parc Fermé, and then you're restricted. You can't make changes to the cars. So you have to find a compromise that works on Saturday but also works on Sunday. And where that compromise sits on this sliding scale of the perfect qualifying car and the perfect race car, you've got to find somewhere in the middle. You know, and teams that might be struggling at, I mean, certain circuits in Monaco, obviously you slide that scale all the way towards qualifying, because you get to the front in qualifying, nobody can overtake, you dictate the pace, you can look after your tyres with almost whatever setup you have. But at other circuits, if you can qualify 5th but have great tyre management over the course of a race stint, then you may be in far better shape than qualifying on pole, but your tyres are destroyed after 10 laps. And that's pretty much what happened to Lewis Hamilton. They had a car where they were struggling for pace around Baku typically, and they went a little bit more towards the qualifying setup, got a decent position on the grid, but then when it got into the race, Lewis's tyres went away far more quickly than Max's. And you saw that from the fact that Lewis had to pit, Max was able to overcut him, so he was able to stay out. And what was the obvious tell was that Max, still when Lewis had pitted, after struggling for performance with his tyres, seeing the drop-off, Max Verstappen still had a huge amount of pace left in his tyres. So his tyres hadn't dropped off at the 10 lap or 11 lap period or whatever it was when Lewis pitted. Therefore their setup had a lot more compliance in it, suited towards the race. So they were looking after tyres. They still had the performance on Saturday because they got a very quick car in both conditions. But that's the trade-off that every team is figuring out. A race car and a qualifying car, where your setup sits in the middle of that somewhere, is the big decisions that they're all trying to make over the course of Friday and Saturday. England cricket team lost to New Zealand yesterday. Any thoughts? No thoughts. What advice did Ant Anstead give you? I'll tell you what advice Ant Anstead gave me. We had a Zoom call recently, and I asked him exactly that. I said, "Have you got any good advice for me?" He went, "Yeah, don't fuck it up." So that was it. So I'll try not to. How will suspension systems change when we move to lower profile tyres, especially when riding curbs, says Paul Charlton. Another great question. So that's obviously 2022. They're testing the tyres now, these low profile 18-inch tyres, as opposed to a 13-inch rim we have now with a giant balloon tyre. That balloon tyre, as you've seen it on the slow-mos, takes up a huge amount of the car's compliance over things like lumps and bumps and curbs. It squashes and it contorts, doesn't it, over those lumps and bumps and over the curbs. Well, a low profile tyre when we go to 18-inch rims is not going to be able to do that in anywhere near the same amount, and so that compliance has to shift from the tyre to the suspension, and therefore the suspension gets completely redesigned. Now from an engineer's perspective, that's great, because a lot of that movement, that suspension movement, now falls back under your control of the car's suspension, which can be fine-tuned, it can be tweaked. With a tyre, that's Pirelli's bit. You have no control other than tyre temperatures and pressures of how that squashes and how that moves. So actually, the engineers will love eventually the fact that they can now bring that suspension movement back under their design, under their control, that can be played with over the course of a race weekend, much more so than the current balloon tyres do. So what it will look like, we don't yet know. I mean, it won't look too much different, but what the technology will look like under the skin, that's what they'll all be figuring out right now with their various simulation programs. F1 Fiend says the Wave rules. Yeah, the Wave is the place I went surfing down in Bristol. It's wicked. Is Marc tyre burning because they ride too low? No, I don't think so. It's more about the fact that because it's typically rear tyres that Mercedes are struggling with, either to get temperature into them or when they've got it to hold on to that. And a lot of that surely has to come from this loss of rear downforce with the regulations for this year. The changes that were made to the rear of the floor, to the brake ducts, to the rear of the diffuser, they've all impacted largely on rear downforce levels. And because Mercedes have that low rate concept, and that's been hit harder than the teams that have the high rate concept for various reasons, they've probably suffered more in that regard. If you've got less rear downforce, you still need to shift the balance between front and rear. So effectively, you've lost a chunk of your rear downforce. Well, that rear downforce is one of the tools that's there to help you manage rear tyres. If you've got less load, aero load, pushing on the rear of the car, the tyres are going to start to, or the car is going to start to slide more. Then you start to overheat, you start to grain them, you start to wear them. So it's a spiral of problems that will all of at least be largely to blame for that, the impact the new regulations have had on those low rate cars. Will track limits be a big issue at Paul Ricard? I'm going to say probably. It's one of those tracks, as we all know, that has endless runoff area, and so if the teams are allowed to, there'll be certain corners where they would abuse that runoff area because it's a faster way around the racetrack. The FIA will have a plan in place for where they're going to police those and how they're going to police them, but yes, expect it to be a big issue at some point this weekend, I'm sure. The other thing about Paul Ricard, I just did a bit of digging into the reprofiling of the circuit. If you remember, I said the circuit on almost, I think there's only one corner, I think turn 10 is the only corner that hasn't been in some way reprofiled. And when I say reprofiled, they originally had a plan to completely reshape the layout of the track in certain areas. That's been pegged back, but what they did do was they resurfaced it all to get rid of a lot of the bumps in all of the corners, apart from turn 10. And when they were resurfacing, they also took the opportunity to reprofile things like the cambers on the corners, some of the curbing. They have changed some of the entries and the exits of those corners. So as well as it being brand new tarmac, which will be dark and black, which absorbs the sun if it's a hot day and heats up much quicker, it'll also be smoother. It'll be a very similar type of asphalt to the one they had before. That's at Pirelli's request because they've done a lot of their 18-inch rim testing at Paul Ricard, so they didn't want some vastly different tarmac going down. So very similar tarmac, but there will be different profiles, and that will have an impact, whether they are on camber or off camber, whether that camber changes because they've had to deal with certain drainage issues, so maybe some of them have a crest in the middle. These are tiny details, but will have an impact on how the cars are able to navigate those. So that's another learning experience for the teams, and no one's been there yet and tried it in an F1 car. And it may well affect lap time. I don't know which way it might go. Nobody necessarily does yet, but that's going to be an interesting learning experience over the course of Friday. William Harris says, get Elvis's book, The Mechanic. It's amazing. And he's absolutely right. Go get it. Link in the description. Thank you, William. I'm glad you liked it. Right. Is carbon fibre the last word in F1 car part construction, or are there any newer composites that do a better job that don't cost much more or less? So there are lots of new technologies. At the moment, carbon fibre is still the optimum in terms of its strength to weight, but there are lots of advanced composites. And in fact, the teams are constantly working on advanced composites for various things, whether it's Mclaren looking at advanced technologies with that side of their business, whether it's on the F1 team. There are some restrictions. There are things like carbon nanotubes, which people have used in composites to try and, which can be even lighter and stronger, but they're specifically banned in the F1 regulations, again for cost reasons. Graphene is something that teams have looked at in various regards, both in composites and, as many of you know, in the fluid that a company that I am part of has developed, a graphene cooling fluid, which uses those nanoparticles inside a cooling fluid to get the heat transfer benefits. So these kind of technologies are all there on the horizon. You may well have also seen that because we've got a shift towards a more sustainable F1, they've done testing on making components. They made a nose cone out of, I forget the material now, somebody will tell me. It was some kind of ecological, was it hemp? maybe hemp, ecological material or sustainable material, and it was able to pass an FIA crash test. So it had the same crumple properties that the current nose cones have to pass. Now that's a huge advancement. Currently it's a huge amount heavier than a current carbon fibre nose cone. So that's the next challenge, to bring those technologies down in weight and size. But those technologies exist and are being developed as we speak. What is the halo made out of? Titanium or titanium and carbon fibre? It's made out of titanium and has a carbon fibre shroud over the top. So that's one of the reasons the cars have got heavier, because that's a substantial chunk of weight that's been bolted onto the car in recent years. And that has contributed to the cars getting heavier. It's certainly not the only reason, but that's one of them. That, in that respect, of course, it has a much greater value than the cost of the weight of the car going up. Did you see Clarkson's farm on Prime? No, I did not. Could we see more tyre manufacturers in F1 soon? Not for the foreseeable future. Pirelli have signed, because we're switching to the 18-inch rims and the lower profile tyres, Pirelli signed a contract which saw them run out this current run on the 13-inch tyre and take them into the 18-inch rim. So because they're doing all of that development work at great cost, they have a contract, and I forget how many years it is, but that runs a couple of years into the new regulations. So we're not going to see anybody coming in soon. I'm not sure we will see more than one manufacturer, because the tyre wars that we've had in the past, A, cost a huge amount of money and don't necessarily improve the racing. They can make cars go quicker by advancing the technology behind tyres, but the cost associated with that just goes through the roof massively, as we all experienced in days gone by. It also detracts from the value of a supplier like Pirelli or whoever having a sole contract as the sole supplier. Their marketing benefits, of course, are far greater. If two suppliers come in and they have a war, one of them is going to be paying still a huge amount of money, but will be the worst tyre supplier in Formula One. And I can hear you all now going, already Pirelli's the worst tyre supplier in Formula One. Unfair and uncalled for, but I can hear you doing it. So from a marketing perspective, it's less attractive to some manufacturers to go into a tyre war, because they've got to spend a huge amount of money and still may not come out as the best. Then it becomes difficult to sell their tyres. Let me see. Where can I buy a copy of your book? You can buy it on Amazon. There's a link in the description of all of my videos. Go and check it out. Thank you very much. Is it a big job to modify a chassis for a taller driver, says Jason Hanna? Yes, if you had to modify a chassis, I mean, rare that you have to modify the chassis, because the chassis is typically a set length. What you do, if you haven't got a really tall driver, you can package things around that chassis to suit. So you can have a few more things behind the driver. You can move the driver further forward, which can help with the weight distribution of the car, for example. Where your pedals sit in relation to the crash structure at the front, where your suspension sits in front or behind your pedals or above your pedals, for example. If you suddenly get like a stand-in driver like a Nico Hülkenberg come in, and your car was designed for smaller people, or George Russell coming into Lewis Hamilton's car where they designed it around Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton, both quite short, well, you don't redesign the chassis, but what you have to do is start modifying things like pedals, start modifying the seat, maybe moving some electrical boxes or something that might be behind the seat to allow you to bring that seat further back, maybe sit him more upright. They're all compromises to the ideal weight distribution and centre of gravity, but if you've got to get a driver in at short notice, that's what you have to do. If you're designing a car with a tall driver in mind, obviously you take all that into consideration and you figure it out from the drawing board. Are there any new engine suppliers coming into F1 soon? Well, the very first time you will see, I mean, obviously apart from Red Bull powertrains, if we take that out of the equation, the next time you will see any potential new engine manufacturers is, of course, 2025, when the new set of power units come in. It would make no sense for somebody to try and join the party now. They'd be so far behind the curve, they'd have to spend so much money developing an engine that only has a couple of years left. So there'll be teams that are already looking, there are teams that are already looking, behind the scenes at the feasibility of coming into the sport when the next set of regs come in 25. We know that Porsche have been sniffing around, or certainly the Volkswagen Audi group. We know that others have expressed interest, but we haven't finalised a set of regs, and until we do that, no one's going to sign up. Some of these companies, though, are already involved in the discussions to decide what that next set of regulations are. So Volkswagen Audi Group are currently sitting on that board that's helping to shape the future regulations. So they're having an input, which is obviously a good sign. So the answer is we don't know, and it will depend on the intricacies of how those regulations shape up. Because the same thing happened last time, if you remember, before the hybrid era. Porsche, in fact, had a single-cylinder Formula 1 engine heavily in development, advanced development, and then decided in the end it wasn't right for them and they pulled the plug. So anything can happen, and it's a very expensive sport to get into. So, you know, it's not the most attractive. They are trying to make it more attractive with the technologies and with cost caps and things like that, but we'll have to wait and see. Yes, I know it's Porsche. I know, I always get it wrong. Yeah, interesting that Paddy Lowe is investing heavily in biofuels. He's a clever guy. He is. I'm actually trying to do a podcast, one of my Pit Lane Life Lessons podcasts with Paddy Lowe very soon. So I'll get to the bottom of that. But he's working. I've spoken to him. He's working on some really interesting stuff. Yeah, if I can pin him down for a date and get a conversation out of him for a podcast, you'll hear all about it. Is it beer o'clock? Not yet, not yet. William Harris, don't scare me. It's 15 minutes yet. Come on now, I've still got to give away these Paddock Club passes. Right, do you think we'll see a Chinese team joining in 2025? Absolutely no idea, no idea. Are the new cars smaller? Do you know what? I can't remember in terms of dimensions. They are actually heavier. I don't think they're going to be... If they are smaller, it's not going to be very much at all. But yeah, they're still getting heavier for sure. Oh, Jason Morgan. I mean, I'm embarrassed to read this out, but I'll just do it because you'll get the abuse rather than me. Jason Morgan says, Bristol Bus Company made a bus that ran on human poo. If F1 did that, then the cars would go like stink. I'll leave you to abuse Jason Morgan in response to that one. Kindly, obviously. Thanks, Jason. Magnussen had a nice result in Detroit yesterday. He did. It's good to see those F1 boys doing well out there. Romain Grosjean, his car was on fire again at the weekend. You see that? But yeah, good result from Magnussen. F1 will go to Miami before they do Indy again. Well, it's possible, but I do know that there have been conversations for this year, given that we've now cancelled another couple of races and cancelled Canada and Mexico's looking dubious, that Indianapolis definitely have had some conversations about running a second race, stand-in race this year. I don't think it's going to come part of the calendar for future years yet. It will definitely be Miami first, but they may well step in and host a race. We'll have to keep an eye on that one. Well, in fact, Janitor is back, has asked a similar question about Indy. So have you got any inside info on Indy being a replacement for the missing races? Well, that's as much inside info as I've got. Conversations have happened. Don't really know any more than that. Did you see what Lewis said about heavier cars, contradicting what they want with better fuel Yeah, absolutely. That's what we were speaking about earlier. Lewis is absolutely right. We talked a bit about this earlier on in the show. So he's right. The cars are too heavy and they're too big, and it absolutely goes against this idea of efficiency, because a bigger, heavier car needs even more energy to push it around the racetrack, and yet we're trying to become more energy efficient as a sport. So yeah, of course, it's a conflict there. Right. Perez breaks the Red Bull curse. He did, didn't he? Well played, Sergio Perez. I was very, very pleased for him the other week. I thought it was a really great result, great confidence booster, and he does also look like he's finding his feet in that team, which is great for them and probably great for the championship. Right. Is the diet between a mechanic and a driver different? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. The drivers are not in the bars on a Saturday night smashing a bunch of pints down with their burger and chips. I mean, I'm joking to some extent. The pit crews you know, nobody follows the same regime as a driver inside the team, you know, necessarily. But as if you've followed my podcast, you'll know this by now, that the teams do now treat the pit crew much more like the athletes they treat the drivers in terms of physical training regimes, but also dietary regimes, because there is a benefit in terms of optimizing their human performance on a Sunday afternoon when it comes to bursting out the garage and making the right decisions and all of those things that all play into the overall outcome when you're trying to win a Grand Prix. So, you know, it's tiny details, but it's those tiny details that matter. Right, shall we give away a couple of virtual paddock passes for the French Grand Prix? As I said, thank you to everybody who took part after last week's video, sharing it around, saying some lovely things about it as well. That wasn't part of the requisite for winning, but if you shared it, you were in the hat. On any platform, and I've been through all of them. I never go on Facebook, but I did it for you because a few people shared it on there, so thank you for that. This is the virtual version of the Paddock Club, an exclusive opportunity to have access for the French Grand Prix in the build up to that French Grand Prix, and a huge thank you to F1 and F1's Virtual Paddock Club for offering me these 2 tickets to give away. That's a huge deal. I hope you really appreciate how big this is. It's an exclusive club. Very few people get access. It's largely for corporate hospitality and that kind of thing. But you get this access to a Zoom call 2 hours before the Grand Prix. I will contact the winners directly. I've got your addresses, or your social addresses. I can DM you, and I will do, to get an email address when you'll then get the Zoom link for Sunday and the password and everything. You'll go in, you'll get access to interviews from drivers, from key F1 personnel, as I said before, Sean Kelly, the virtual statman, be on. And on top of that, you get the opportunity to ask questions to those people in the Zoom call, in the Zoom chat. And because there's not very many people in it, there's a reasonable chance you might get your question answered. I don't know who's on the agenda yet for this French Grand Prix weekend, but it will be impressive because all the others that I've been a part of have been. So, without further ado, I have picked completely at random 2 people who kindly shared this video. This one on Twitter was at Koenigzig, and I will, don't worry if you're not watching right now, you didn't hear it at the right time, I will be contacting you, so you don't need to do anything, just check your social inboxes. Koenigzig, congratulations to you, I'll be in touch. And the other, so that one was off Twitter. This one I think was Facebook from memory, but I'll make sure I get in touch with you. Advo of Change. Congratulations to you as well. I will be in touch and I will get you those passes, the Zoom link with the password, and I hope you have a wonderful experience on Sunday. It's just a new way, or a different way, of having your build up to the Grand Prix. You can still have the TV on in the background on another screen if you want, but I highly recommend you take part in this. I'd love to know your feedback afterwards. I'd love to know what you thought of it. Did you have a great weekend? Was it a good experience? Perhaps share that around with us on the channel next week. That would be great. But congratulations to both of you. Advo of Change and Koenigzig. I will be in touch. Right, we have, 5 minutes to go. Let us take another couple of prizes. Thinking of prizes, right? I was on this Aston Martin call today, and very kindly, knowing that I was going to be on the call today, they sent me this. Can you see that? Let's move that over. That is a piece of Sebastian Vettel's bodywork from one of the races this year. And it's mounted in this lovely glass box with a signature from Sebastian and a little inscription on the front, which I think is a really lovely little gift. I'm very grateful to Aston Martin for sending it to me, but because I'm such a nice guy, I'm going to give it to one of you guys. So I want to know, who are the Aston Martin fans out there? I haven't yet decided how I'm going to do it. I'm actually thinking I might do it through the SeedStream app. So if you are part of the SeedStream community, then keep an eye out, because I'm going to put a post probably on SeedStream with a view to giving this away. A genuine piece of Sebastian Vettel's Aston Martin bodywork from one of the races this year. It's brand new, with Sebastian's signature in there as well. I also got sent some lovely chocolate racing helmets, but I'm not giving those away. I'm going to eat them. But I will give this away. So if you're in the SeedStream community, if you have the SeedStream app, which is an app that I'm involved with, we're sort of testing it, we're rolling out at the moment, we've taken some major steps forward with it. It's a really great app. I use it all the time for all of my F1 news and content. Then you are in with a shot. If you're not yet part of the SeedStream community, go get the app. It's totally free. It's a very, very simple, quick sign up, takes 10 seconds, and then you're in the app. And once you're in the app, just keep an eye out for my post, which will come over the next couple of days, and I will give this away. That's nice of me, isn't it? Because I quite like that. I could have kept that. So listen, go get the SeedStream app. Again, there's a link to that in the description of all of my videos. So in any of my videos, check out the description. It'll tell you there's a link to get there. It's just seedstream.org is the website, and there's then links to get to the Apple version for iPhones or the Android version. But go check out SeedStream. I think you'll like it anyway, and you'll be in with a chance of winning this lovely little piece of F1 history. Okay, right, 5 minutes to go. Shall we have a question from somebody to finish off with? Alex's V says, Mark isn't a Vettel fan. No, I am a massive Vettel fan, and I genuinely love this. I just showed this to my son. He went, that's amazing. What, we watched that piece on TV and we were watching a race? I went, yeah, that's an actual piece. He's like, wow, that's amazing. It is amazing. It's a lovely thing. So you could win that. Right, come on, let's have a quick question. We've got a couple of minutes to go. Who wants to know something before we switch off and I go and get my beer? Can they please point arrows on the corners of the track in France so we can tell which way the track goes? I get dizzy and confused watching that race, says Rob Graham. Yeah, I feel your pain on that one, but you'll figure it out over the course of Friday, mate. You'll be fine. Thoughts on rumours that the cause for tyre failures was teams tricking the sensors and running lower pressures? Okay, that's quite a big question. We've only got a couple of minutes. It's interesting, this, and there's going to be a lot more digging done about this. I have no idea whether that's the case or not. There is a minimum tyre pressure, as we all know. Pirelli, as you probably know, upped the minimum tyre pressure on the rear of the car between Friday and Saturday. Now that's not uncommon. That often happens when they've done a bit of running on Friday. Pirelli will often tweak the minimum pressures, issue that to the teams. Those pressures are all checked by the FIA as part of the scrutineering the FIA scrutineers process before qualifying, before a race, on the way back in. So these things are monitored very carefully, but there is a suggestion that potentially one or two teams may have been trying to trick the system. A lower tyre pressure is advantageous to the teams because you can also get lower pressures, and as you push the tyre harder, the pressure builds. Then the temperature builds and the tyre pressure builds as well. And if you started lower, your hot pressure will be in the optimum. If you have to start higher and you're still pushing that hard, you potentially start to raise an even higher tyre pressure, which is disadvantageous to the team. So the teams will always want to start with the lowest tyre pressures they can, and they always do start at the minimum pressure. If you could somehow get around that and start lower, there's potentially lap time in it, and even tyre management in that, tyre longevity in doing that as well. So there would be an advantage doing it. I'm not quite sure the details of how it's suspected that somebody might have been doing it, but I will start to dig into it and look around and see if I can find something out. And if I do, of course, I will be letting you know first. That, I'm afraid, is your lot. I'm going to go and get a beer. It's very hot here in the UK, so a beer is going to slip down very, very easy tonight. I hope you all have a wonderful week and then a wonderful weekend. I've got a full week of Wheeler Dealers filming this week, and then I'm back on Friday to get back involved and catch up with the Grand Prix. Well done again to those two of you who won the 2 Virtual Paddock Club passes. That's Advo of Change and Koenig Zig. Congratulations. I'll be in touch very soon. I hope you have a wonderful experience, and I can't wait to hear all about it. Have a good one, folks. I'll catch up with you very, very soon. Ta-da!